Hello, everyone. I am Ulrike Al-Khamis, Director of Collections and Public Programs, and I'm very happy to have with me today Professor Azim Nanji, who is a member of the Aga Khan Museum's Academic and Scientific Advisory Committee, a very distinguished scholar, member of the juries for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and Music, and really well known in the field of Islamic studies at large. Today, the two of us would like to explore some artworks in the Aga Khan Museum and how we can contemplate them and Islamic spirituality and faith, particularly in this month of Ramadan, which of course is this year running from late April to May. We have here a beautiful tile panel, probably from Syria, from the 16th century. And it's one of the favorite objects in the collection as far as I'm concerned. It's assumed to come from the late 16th century Darwish Pasha Mosque in Damascus. And it shows an arched niche, a motif that of course traditionally is used in a mosque context to indicate the direction of prayer towards Mecca. In the center of the niche, we see a large lamp with an Arabic inscription that reads, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. Professor Nanji, this is a very significant phrase. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? How does it translate? And what is its significance for Muslims?
So simply translated, it means that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And I think what you have here are the defining underlying principles of Islam expressed through the idea of the unity of God, that God is a transcendental unity, but he communicates, and he communicates through his messengers. And the messenger that he has chosen to communicate this particular revelation is Muhammad. So very, very much at the core of what Islam stands for. But then you also have, at the same time, the embracing of this idea by millions of Muslims who live in different parts of the world, who speak different languages, come from different ethnicities, but they are united by this affirmation, this testimony that they witness about the unity of God and the role of the Prophet Muhammad as God's messenger.
It is, of course, a beautiful saying, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And it's interesting that on this lamp, the profession of faith is inscribed as at the heart of the niche. What do you think the symbolism intended might here, Professor Nanji? What does this image refer to?
So as we look at the panel, we see that the niche echoes a verse of the Quran that we may probably want to come back to later. But it's also the orientation for the believer to try and be in communication with God. So it doesn't matter where you are. You might be in a place of prayer, a mosque, a zawiya, a Jamaat Khana, but your orientation is defined by this niche as allowing you to be in communication and to respond to God through your prayers. So the idea that you have a focal point that all Muslims turn to when they pray enhances that idea of the unity of God, but also the unity of believers.
This is so beautiful. And coming back to the issue of light that you mentioned at the beginning, it's of course interesting that this subject is reinforced even more by the two candlesticks that we can see at the bottom of the niche. And it really seems that they are emphasizing the connection of God's light above and then the spiritual enlightenment through prayer. So tell us a little bit about the specific significance of light.
One of the most evocative verses in the Quran, the Ayatul Nur, of course, creates the language of symbolism, but also the language of connection. So God permeates, suffuses through his light all of creation. So God is not absent from creation. And we have another verse elsewhere that speaks of wherever you turn, there is the face of God. And so this idea that the divine presence is an imminent one. It is not remote. And what this symbolism in that verse of light does is it creates a cascading effect, an effect where you allow that notion of light to suffuse the universe throughout, and then that light becomes the focus of your personal search, your own pursuit of enlightenment through the heart. So the light is present all around you, but it is also present and perceived in your heart.
It's very beautiful. And of course, in this particular instance, just looking at the niche, it also draws your meditative attention towards both the prayer and of course also the contemplation of the light of God. But there are also two very interesting and unusual additional aspects in this niche design, which we don't normally find in an artistic interpretation of the prayer niche, and that is two very curious dark blue footprints just beneath the lamp. And Professor Nanji, what do you think these two motifs represent? Because they do not always occur in mihrab designs around the world.
So I think we go back to the Shahada. The Shahada is about the unity of God, but it's also about Muhammad, the Prophet, being his messenger. And one of the traditions that has evolved across time and space in the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community, is the celebration of the Prophet. The Prophet is integral to the experience of individuals about their faith. And I remember growing up as a child in Kenya, listening to poetry celebrating the Prophet. And that celebration of the Prophet occurs in every language, in so many devotional forms, through music, through narration of his life. So the everyday life of the Prophet is something that's very intimately connected in the way in which Muslims practice their faith. So I think what you have in this footprints is a reminder. It's a symbol of how the Prophet is also integral to the way in which his exemplary life as a believer becomes a mirror for your actions and your behavior. So I think when I see these footprints and sandals, they are a reminder to ensure that we say blessings on the Prophet and his family as part of the way in which we practice our faith.
Yes, absolutely. And of course also how, as in a sense the first Imam, he always led the prayer of his community. And there we move on to actually the next very crucial principle within Islam, and that is devotion and prayer. And the second object I would like to share with you is an illuminated album page with the Surat Al-Fatiha, which was written in the late 16th century by one Mahmud ibn Ishaq al-Shihabi, originally from Herat. And what I like about it is that it is a devotion in itself, because of course calligraphy was often practiced as a meditative, contemplative activity that really engaged with your devotion to God and as an artistic prayer in so many ways. But Surat Al-Fatiha in this context is also very interesting, because it plays a very particular role in Muslim prayer. Professor Nanji, why do you think that the calligrapher chose this particular Quranic chapter for his meditative artistic exercise?
I think, just to pick up on this very important point you make about calligraphy, the first verses of the Quran ask the Prophet to recite, to vocalize, to communicate the message. And those verses also speak about the symbolism of the pen, which dispels ignorance, because the Quran, in articulating the message through the Prophet, is dispelling ignorance. So here we have an oral voice that is then recorded in writing and also recited at the same time. So the recording in writing has to measure up to the tremendous power and eloquence of the spoken voice itself. And I think calligraphy becomes the tool which Muslims use to capture that magnificence. And I think you see it in so many different forms across so many Muslim cultures, and particularly with regards to the Surat Al-Fatiha, which is also known as the opening or the beginning chapter. I think the verses allow a Muslim not simply to see in its calligraphic form and in its voiced form an act of prayer, but I think they also sum up all of the components of Islam that are going to continue throughout the Quran and in the life of a believing Muslim. So you have, I think, the attributes of God that Muslims remind themselves about. The fact that God is compassionate, He's forgiving, He guides, He provides a support in times of trouble. And a believer turns to God, because not only does the believer want to communicate and respond to God's message, but he also wants to create a relationship. And that relationship is focused on how your outer and inner life is in balance. That is why I think in the verse you also see a prayer on guidance. Guide us to the right path. And I think this idea of the Surat Al-Mustaqim, the notion of the right path, is one that allows Muslims to mediate between their material and their spiritual lives.
Absolutely. And it also is so crucial to recall this surah throughout important stages of life as well, right?
Exactly, because it is part of every prayer. It is part of every rite of passage, where from the time the child is born, it is evoked on all ceremonial occasions. So it's a very integral part of the daily life of prayer, but also the growing life of the believer and the community throughout the various stages that you go through.
please remind us of the verses before we move on. It is such a wonderful chapter to recall in the middle of our conversation, just as we are at this point contemplating this beautiful artwork.
So they are Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The idea that we praise God because God is the sustainer of the worlds. And it's interesting that the Alameen is in plural, so it speaks to the infinite universe, infinite to our eyes and to our consciousness, because if God is above this creation, and as in our time we explore more galaxies, more worlds, we realize that our planet is just a small dot in the whole cosmos. And then I think this notion that God is the focal point of prayer. You alone we pray to. It's this idea that we seek support from you, but you are the focus of our lives. And the notion that God's attributes that are then enumerated, particularly the notion of Maliki Yawmiddin, it's a reminder that life that you live is a life of accountability, that your actions matter. They matter because they have consequences. And that is why in the subsequent verses, you ask to be guided to the right path. So I think very much an elaboration of a life of prayer, a life of faith, but also the life for an individual searching for that balance in life.
Yes, and action, of course, is a very crucial part of living the faith as well, right? And it leads us to contemplate our next object in the collection, which is a kashkul, or a collecting bowl, and it symbolizes the Islamic principle of charity and being hospitable and welcoming to the vulnerable and the destitute. And this wonderful object here was probably once used in by Sufi Muslim mystics who had abandoned ordinary life to dedicate themselves exclusively to seeking God. And with an object like this, they would have elicited donations, food, alms for the community at the time. The piece we have here is actually quite enormous. It's about 61 centimeters long and very elaborately executed and engraved in brass. It comes from the late 16th century and probably from Iran. So it's a ceremonial object, but simpler materials were also used for these kashkuls, as they were carried by mystics that were seeking God in ways away from the traditional communal and ritual approaches. Talk to us a little bit, Professor Nanji, about the many different ways in which Muslim cultures and societies have lived the principle of charity through the ages, and the many different ways of dogmatic, but also of personal and individual ways of dedicating oneself through looking after the vulnerable and the orphans and the widows, as is always emphasized in the Quran.
The notion of giving is represented by the word zakat. And that it's a very multivalent word. It speaks of giving, but it also speaks of generosity. It's the idea of purification. It's the idea of increase. And it represents acts of compassion that are not merely material. And I think particularly living at the time that we do, we see so many acts of generosity and compassion that are about reaching out, they're about caring, and they don't necessarily involve giving, of material resources. So in the strict sense of the word, this notion of zakat sort of is a word that I think encompasses much more than charity. And I think particularly, even though the stories about the Sufis who went around as mendicants is there, and there are examples of that in Muslim history and practice, the purpose for which these collections are meant are for social purposes, for improving human life, for ensuring that those who are marginalized, those who are the greatest in need, are not left behind. And so it carries that very important message of social justice, which is key to understanding the early part of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes, and I remember in my 10 years in the Middle East, it was amazing to see how charity and dedication to the collective or to the community could come through in so many different ways, be it just by sharing food with neighbors, be it by providing, particularly, of course, during Ramadan, the meals, the iftar meals for Indian workers on a building site, but then also at the higher level of, let's say, royal patrons or governmental patrons, giving a new mosque or giving a new hospital or some new social initiative for the community. So really this awareness of being responsible for looking after everyone in the community can be seen at so many different levels. And actually it is also, I often think of, particularly at this point in time, in this crisis we are finding ourselves in, that this seems to be a human instinct as well, that is a universal ideal in so many ways when we look at all the generosity and helpfulness that we experience at the moment from all the communities and religions around us. It's actually very, very heartening to see how everybody comes together for the benefit of those who are in need, who are alone, who don't know and are unable to manage.
And as we see, I think, among so many of the frontline workers who are involved in helping people today, we see that it also involves the sharing of time, of knowledge, so that it's a much more comprehensive notion of how you relate to society through your social conscience.
Absolutely, and living your faith through action, through the actions of your everyday life, right?
Of course.
Yes. It's nice going back to our object for a moment to see that here too, in the Persian inscriptions, in the Persian verses that are engraved on this wonderful bowl, again there is reference made to the Prophet Muhammad, and in fact to his two most famous miracles, i.e. the splitting of the moon and then the ascension to the heavens, the Mi'raj, which of course is a miraculous event that is very much commemorated in the month of Ramadan and ties in very nicely with our next theme and artwork. Fasting in the month of Ramadan is a very crucial activity to re-establish the connection with the faith, to again remember those who are in need and are hungry and have not, and many different ways of fasting, physical, metaphorical, really come into play during this time. And part of the ritual is also the daily immersion, the reciting and the studying of the Quran. And I'm showing you here a beautiful manuscript that is part of a 30-part Quran that was created in the 14th century in Syria or in Egypt. And it was designed in a way that every part or juz would be read on one of the 30 days of the Muslim lunar month of Ramadan. And the pages that you can see here give us 2 chapters of the Holy Quran. One of them, Surah 17, Al-Isra, also refers to the night journey that is referred to in the Persian poem on the Kashkur. Professor Nanji, the Surat Al-Isra or night journey chapter plays a significant part in Muslim belief for many reasons, and particularly at this point, at this time of Ramadan. Could you tell us a little bit about its significance?
We've just, I think, as we approach the completion of the month of Ramadan, most Muslims in these last 10 days will have celebrated Laylatul Qadr during one night. And the imagery of Laylatul Qadr is about descent. And the imagery of the Mi'raj is about ascent. So you have this complementarity in the way in which this spiritual practice has come to be understood throughout Muslim thought. God, during that night, sends his angels so that they might support the community, they might support believers, and enable them during that night to experience some of the most profound aspects of spiritual life. And that is why Muslims spend as much of that night in contemplation and recitation as they can. The Mi'raj, again, takes us back to the Prophet. It's the story of the Prophet's own ascension, his own reaching through his journey to the threshold of the divine. And what I find fascinating in many different accounts of that story is that during that night journey, as it is called, he is transported, most would say spiritually, but there are also wonderful accounts of how he's transported on a flying horse. So the idea that this process of ascension in the accounts that surround the story are of him meeting the great prophets. So at every station in that journey, he meets and he speaks to the great prophets. And this creates for me the story of the history of religions, that the prophets are in communication with each other. Traditions speak to each other. There's pluralism in the history of religion. And the prophet's message is affirmed by these previous prophets. And it is after having passed through that stage that he then enters into the presence of God. So we have both an account of a spiritual journey, but a journey throughout history, that throughout history, God has spoken to humanity, and humanity has sought to try through their spiritual lives to enter into communication with him through the messages received from all the great prophets.
It's wonderful how encounters and journeys really are threads that run through all the aspects of Islamic faith and spirituality, and both in metaphorical and in physical ways. And these themes also lead us most beautifully to our next and last object in the collection, which is a manuscript of the Dala'il al-Khairat, a prayer book that was first written by a Moroccan mystic in the 15th century, Muhammad ibn Sulaiman al-Jazuli. And we see here a copy that was calligraphed by Ibrahim al-Hafiz for a citizen of Istanbul in 1793. Now, the pilgrimage is probably the most aspirational journey of Muslims through time and space, the Hajj as it is called. And the Quran speaks about the directive to go and visit once in your lifetime if you are physically and financially able. And over the centuries, of course, Muslims have tried to follow that call in their various different cultural settings and from their various different spiritual traditions as well. Now, what is interesting in this particular work, which is basically a work that compiles prayers and devotions, again directed towards the Prophet, and actually a work that has remained popular in large parts of the Muslim world for hundreds of years, there are only ever two illustrations at the heart of this work. One is the holy site of Mecca al-Mukarramah with the Masjid al-Haram at the center, which we can see on the right. And then, of course, the Mosque of Medina with the Masjid al-Nabi on the left. And here in this 18th century Ottoman Turkish copy, it's interesting that European stylistic elements come into play through the three-dimensional bird's eye view that the artist has applied to depicting these significant sites. So Professor Nanji, talk us through these illustrations a little and tell us about the significance of the various architectural elements that we can see in the two miniatures.
So we have, I think, juxtaposed here two very important kind of architectural symbols. One is the Kaaba, which is a simple cube in Mecca, in the precincts known as the place of Haram, or sacredness. And then in Medina, you have the Mosque of the Prophet, which in history was built by the Prophet. There's an interesting story about how somebody wanted to gift the land where the Prophet built his house and adjacent to it, the place of prayer. And the Prophet declined. He said, no, I will purchase it. And I think it's important to note that engagement that the Prophet had in setting an example for Muslims, that you could have a balance between the space that is in Mecca, the Kaaba, and the space that is in Medina, which allows you to refer back to that founding place. And of course, we know from traditional accounts that the Kaaba is associated with Prophet Ibrahim, that in historical accounts it is also recognized as the first place where Prophet Adam built a space of worship. So there are many stories interwoven with the Kaaba as a focal point, not just for the pilgrimage, but also a historical connection with the past. So it goes beyond the period of the Prophet's mission and takes Muslims back into history, creating for themselves a place in that long history. And the rituals of the pilgrimage allow, we looked at that image of the Prophet's footprints, they allow a believer to walk in the place where the Prophet walked when he performed the pilgrimage. So Muslims are reenacting through the pilgrimage an act of devotion, an act of remembrance, and an act of congregation that the Prophet initiated. So you see in all of the ritual components of the Hajj, Muslims wear the same garb, they dress alike, they perform the same rituals, they come together as a congregation to celebrate both their diversity, because today we know they come from all over the world, as they always did, and yet they participate in a significant ritual that allows them to express their unity. the Prophet's mosque is, of course, critical because that is the space where Muslims go after performing the pilgrimage and remember the Prophet. And they celebrate him. And the Dalail Khairat, as you pointed out, contains prayers and expressions of devotion to the Prophet as well. So again, you get that balance where ritual engages an individual in their own journey to pursue enlightenment, but it also engages the community in a collective act that brings them together as a community.
Yes, and you said to me in another conversation, which I think is a wonderful way of kind of closing the circle of our conversation, that in a sense with these two holy sites that pilgrims visit, we come back to the fundamentals of the Shahada, which is, you know, your submission to the will of God and acknowledging your devotion to the first among the human beings and the Muslims in the Ummah, the Prophet Muhammad, as symbolized through his mosque in Medina and the visit that always follows the main pilgrimage.
Exactly. The Shahada expresses that feeling of oneness, and the Hajj captures that feeling of oneness in practice.
Thank you very much, Professor Nanji, for this wonderful, inspiring conversation. And I hope that you, our audience, enjoyed yourself and also realized how much the artworks in the Aga Khan Museum have to tell us about Islamic faith and spirituality, and of course, well beyond that, many stories about the human experience at large. I hope that we will soon be able to welcome you back to the museum, and in the meantime, you can find us in the virtual museum and you can explore our online collection, contemplating both the faith and the human experience. Thank you very much, Professor Nanji.